So good to see each and every one. So good for us to be together. Last Lord's Day evening, we began a lesson, and we hope to continue our study this evening of that study. In fact, after the services that night, I believe it was Sister Maddox that made the remark that the sermon reminded her of years ago of a sermon that Brother Sutton did when he used bed sheets for the chart for what we have today is a projector. Well, I brought one of the bed sheets just so you could see what we're talking about. I know there's some of you that may want to reminisce and see it. There's some of you, in fact, maybe a lot of you that have never seen one. If I'm not badly mistaken, this is the chart that my dad gave to me when I was 16 years old. I had read the gospel 4 years earlier, and he gave me that chart and said, "E.R., take this, hang it up, and study it, and when you're ready, I want you to preach it." So I did it for, best I can remember, about 2 weeks, and I told him that I was ready. And so, if I'm not badly mistaken, this is the chart that he gave me. It's on what we talked about in our Bible, in our worship service this morning about the two builders in Matthew chapter 7. So if you want to see it after services, I'm more than glad to unfold it and let you see it, to reminisce, or for those that may have never seen one, to let you have that opportunity. But the sermon last Sunday night brought that remembrance back to Sister Maddox. We talked about in the beginning of our study, does it matter what we believe? Does it matter about authority? Does it matter about fellowship? Does it matter about which church? And all of these subjects we have covered at one point or another in the past, some in not the too distant past. But what we wanted to consider, and we began that in our study last week, is really does it matter when it comes to which Church of Christ? Because we know that there is a common practice that many people engage in. That is, they find a church that has the Church of Christ on the sign, on the marquee or out in front of the building, and they conclude from that sign that it must be right. And when questioned sometimes about the soundness of a church, you may hear the reply, oh, it's a Church of Christ. Or it may be that they're not institutional, so they're all right. So these are the things that we often hear stated in regards to this matter of which Church of Christ. Because we see and understand, and this is what we talked about last week, that not all churches of Christ are the same. It's sad, we wished it was different, but we have to accept the reality of the situation. There are serious differences in teaching and in practice. And some of these differences are not minor, but rather they're matters that are major. They're not matters of judgment. They're not matters of opinion. Some things are, and some things do dwell in that realm. But the differences that we're talking about are the differences that are not minor by any means whatsoever. And so those things that we asked about in the beginning of our lesson, this lesson, that lesson last week, and this lesson tonight, will build on the foundation that it matters what we believe, it matters about authority, it matters about fellowship, it matters about which church. Last week, we looked at the institutional versus the non-institutional. Remember, we said many people say that, well, it's okay, it's got the sign in front of the building and it's not institutional. So we wanted to look at that. What do we mean when we say it's not institutional? And so that's what we dealt with in most of our study last Sunday evening. When we talk about institutional churches, we're talking about churches that support colleges from the church's treasury. They support a human institution when it comes to the teaching of the gospel. When we talk about institutions, we're talking about churches that takes from their treasuries to support orphan homes. This is the realm of benevolence, that certainly the church has a work involved in benevolence, but not to use another institution in the place of the church to do that work. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about institutionalism. We're talking about the support of these human institutions in the realm of benevolence to be supported out of the treasury of the church. Then we talked about another thing that has come along in the last 50, 75 years, and that's the sponsoring church. This basically is in the realm of evangelism, where the churches are small in many places and cannot afford radio programs or other means of spreading the gospel. So the sponsoring church has been set up to where other churches can funnel money to this sponsoring church under the leadership of its elders. And then those elders will determine whether the money goes to some radio program, some television program, some support of a gospel preacher in whatever the country may be. And then we talked in the close of our study that institutionalism also involves the social gospel. So these are the things that we looked at in last week's lesson, and I hope that you'll recall many of those things that we talked about. And so tonight we want to pick up with what are the differences in the non-institutional churches. Those that do not do the things that we've just looked at in terms of using human institutions to do the work that the church has been assigned to do. And even when it comes to these differences in these non-institutional churches, there's a common idea that many people have. Well, if it's non-institutional, then it's a sound church. That is the idea. And the idea leads to a practice, a very common practice, and that is that there's little, if any, investigation about churches where we place membership and maybe where our family members are attending. Because after all, the church is non-institutional. So there's just no investigation. So that's the idea. But it's important for us to understand how that apostasy develops. In fact, Hebrews chapter 2 and verse 1, just reading it from the New King James, it says, "Therefore we must give the more earnest heed to the things we have heard, lest we drift away." The King James Version says, "Therefore we ought to give the more earnest heed to the things which we have heard, lest at any time we should let them slip." In fact, there's a footnote in many King James versions of the Bible that says, "run out as leaking vessels," concerning the drifting away, or as the King James puts it, let them slip. And when we think about a leaking vessel, the thing that comes to my mind is faucet. Many of us have faucets in our home, in the bathrooms, in the kitchen. We have wash basins, we have bathtubs, we have showers, and we're very concerned when there develops a drip in any of those faucets, because we know that even though the drip appears to be very small, yet over time it adds up. In fact, I did a little research and I found out that a faucet or a shower head that drips 120 drops a minute, which is not really out of the question. 120 drops of water a minute. In 1 day's time, it will have consumed 11 gallons of water in 1 day's time. And you add that up to a month, which most of us pay our water bills about a month. You take that by the month, you're looking at 330 gallons of water that's dripping from that faucet that you're not getting any benefit from whatsoever. But it will, and they'll show up on your water bill. So we understand what Hebrews 2 and verse 1 is saying. We need to give more earnest heed to the things that we've heard. The things that we've heard are the things from God's word. Because there's always that danger that we drift away from them. There's always that danger that we let them slip. And I think we can see that in the fact that it is gradual. It's gradual and it's slow. You take a square that's completely a square and it's dark. And over a period of time, we can change that square. We can change the darkness of it to where it gets lighter and lighter and lighter. And then not only we get to the point where the darkness of it has been changed so dramatically that now instead of black, it's white. But now we begin to see that round the corners of it, it's no longer a square. And we continue to see that through developing, this thing can turn very easily, gradually into a circle. So we went from a dark square, a black square, to a white circle. So that's what the Hebrew writer is saying. We can drift away. And the thing about apostasy that we must always be and that we are warned about in the scriptures is that it's gradual, but yet it does the damage. We do drift away if we're not careful. So the steps toward apostasy are gradual. It's not overnight. It's not sudden. It's gradual. And here's pretty much the way that it happens. We have a change in attitude. Our attitude changes about whatever the situation, whatever the matter, whatever the subject might be. We talk about new ideas long before we suggest these ideas to be implemented. And then we slowly introduce this questionable practice. And then before we know it, we have a full innovation into what has taken place. We see this happened in the mid-1800s in a Church of Christ, non-institutional, in the Midway, Kentucky. And the matter pertained to mechanical instruments of music. I want us to read what I've come across. This is on a restoration website. As early as 1851, there were scattered reports of congregations among churches of Christ adding instruments of music to their worship services. However, in 1860, Lewis L. Pinkerton of Midway, Kentucky, responded that as far as he was aware, the church at Midway where he preached was the only one of his knowledge where the instrument had been successfully introduced. The instrument was added amidst much controversy at Midway. What initially caused the problem was that the singing was deplorable. Pinkerton said that the singing would scare even the rats from worship. At first, members met in the home of some brethren on Saturday night for practice. To get the right pitch, they used a little melodeon. Before long, one of the sisters was accompanying the singing with the playing of the little instrument, the melodeon. The group noted how the accompaniment helped the singing. And so they decided the use of it would greatly enhance their worship assemblies. They asked L.L. Pinkerton, their preacher, what he thought of bringing it into the assembly. His response was that he saw no problem with it. So the next Sunday, a melodeon was brought in for worship. Thompson Parrish played the instrument, at the Sunday service. The entrance of this little instrument did not take place smoothly. However, we see the friction was so stern by some that trouble was brewed. One who was strongly against the instrument was Adam Hibbler, one of the elders. Late one night, he, along with his slave, Reuben, went to the church building, where Hibbler held a window open, or while he held a window open, Reuben entered the building and passed the small instrument through to Hibbler. It was put on a wagon and taken to be stored at his barn. Another melodeon, amongst much complaint, was purchased and placed in the building. Around the turn of the 20th century, the Midway Church building was destroyed by fire. Along with it was the destruction of the second melodeon. So some years later, Hibbler's barn was being cleaned out when the second melodeon was found. And this is information that I have found on this website. If you want to know what a melodeon looks like, this is what it looks like. It's a small piano. So this is what we see concerning the introduction of the instrument, the mechanical instrument, into the church at Midway. Now, we're not necessarily talking about the instruments, although it will, as we'll see, come up as things continue to, I wouldn't say progress, I guess the better word would be digress. But concerning these issues among non-institutional churches, today the issues are many, not just one. And it makes the differences harder to identify. And among these issues that are occurring in non-institutional churches is soft preaching. The signs that you can look for that indicates soft preaching is that there are sermons in which there is little or no scripture being used in those sermons. The sermon, the message, when it's at the end, you wonder, well, the point was, what was the message? And you're somewhat left empty with not much of an answer. There's little or no application that's made in the course of the sermon to not only discuss the matter at hand, but how this matter fits in our lives from day to day. There's no real distinctive preaching, no definite distinction. You could just as easily hear this same sermon at some denominational church. It would fit with no problems. It's a non-offensive message. That's not to say that sermons ought to always be offensive, but the nature of truth is that it will offend. But so we're not talking about here, we're just talking about a deliberate effort to avoid anything that would be not offensive and not taking a stand on whatever the current issues there might be going on within the Lord Church. And all of this, I said a moment ago, it's hard to identify because it's not error that's being taught. They're not teaching error. That's not it. It's not what is taught that makes the preaching soft. It is what is not taught that makes the preaching soft. So I hope we understand that. And listening to some preachers, you may never hear lessons on authority. You may never hear a lesson on the one true church that we read about in the New Testament. You may never hear a lesson about what's wrong with denominationalism. You may never hear a lesson on worldliness. And I mean the specifics. You know, I don't know of a preacher, and I don't know if there is one, that's not against sin. They're all against sin. But you need to get them to define what is sin. So that's what I mean here. You'll never hear them teach a lesson on worldliness from the standpoint of specifics. They'll always deal in generalities. And you'll never hear a lesson on divorce and remarriage. And especially sins that can be found among members of the church. You won't hear those lessons either. But you know, there's been a charge that's been made to the preacher. They're to preach the word. In 2 Timothy 4 and verse 2, preach the word. Be in season and out of season. Preachers have been charged to preach the whole counsel, like in Acts chapter 20 and verse 7, where Paul said, I have not shunned to declare unto you the whole counsel of God. So that's what the preacher is charged to do in a congregation. So when it comes to another issue, in addition to soft preaching among non-institutional churches, we see those that are soft and they're tolerant on worldliness. And what I mean by worldliness is social drinking. It's appalling the number of Christians that you hear about that think it's not wrong to go to a business where they work on Christmas or New Year's and engage in social drinking, because their idea is that only drunkenness is forbidden in the scriptures. So this idea of soft and tolerant on worldliness involves things like this. It involves dancing. It involves going to the prom, where all of the dancing that is being done in the modern world today lends itself completely and totally to lasciviousness and to the behavior that it will lead to. And then modesty or immodesty. That's being soft and that's being tolerant, because immodesty is worldliness. When the Bible says that we are to dress in a certain way that certainly sets us apart from the rest of the world around us. And then there's the social and the recreational use of drugs, the CBD that's sprouting up all over the place in our neighborhood, in our towns. Openly advertising on billboards, hemp, the hemp shack. I think I saw one the other day. Lord willing, we'll begin to support Brother Andy Mitchell. I've known Andy ever since he was a young boy. I know his mom and dad. Andy used to be in North Carolina, but he's in Youngstown, Ohio at the moment. And he was losing some of his support, and I found out about it. And so, Lord willing, this coming June, when he loses that support, the church here will pick up on that support. But in talking to him the other day, he said one of the big problems that he's having in the church in Ohio are members of the church over this matter of CBD. And like I said, as many of these things that are springing up in each and every town that we see, and the advertising, the heavy advertising, a lot of these CBD places go in with the vape form of people, what people are doing now. And we see that these things are by our government being legalized, and that only compounds the problem with some Christians not being able to distinguish the right and the wrong of it. And so on and on, worldliness, is something that many churches are so soft and so tolerant in regards to. And what I mean by soft and tolerant, I mean that there's just little or no preaching on the subject. Like I said, they're against sin, but you don't know what sin is. They won't tell you what sin is. They would deal in genealogies. Well, not genealogies, but in generalities. You know, in some cases, they may believe that they are wrong, these things pertaining to worldliness. They may believe that they're wrong, but they won't preach on it. They won't teach on it because some of the members of the church are engaged in them. And then, sad to say, they are those who can also see nothing wrong. And as appalling as that, or surprising as that might be, don't let it be. Members, preachers, you name it. Many are beginning to get to the point, thanks to the influence of the world and the media around us, and the insensitivity that we have been made to feel towards so many of these things. They're just simply many that see nothing wrong. They see nothing wrong with social drinking. They see nothing wrong with dancing. They see nothing wrong with recreational use of drugs, immodesty, you name it. They don't see anything wrong with it. But in either of these cases, what is it that they believe that it's wrong, but they just simply don't preach on it because the congregation members are involved in it, or whether they just don't really see the sin involved in it whatsoever? The fact of the matter is, those that participate in these things are left alone. And nothing is said to rebuke them, nothing is said to correct their sins. And parents, preachers, elders, they may be doing the very same thing. Another issue among non-institutional churches is to tolerate error and the teachers of error. You know, it's not that brethren agree with the error, not necessarily. They just tolerate, and I mean they don't condemn, and they end up fellowshipping those that teach the error. For example, J.W. McGarvey, I think he's got one of the best, if not the best, commentaries on the book of Acts. But J.W. McGarvey believed that instrumental music was not authorized, but he fellowshipped those that used it. You know, the example of this is, I may agree that brother so-and-so teaching on divorce and remarriage ain't right, but use him for meetings and whatever else. And when it's pointed out that a certain church has repeatedly used men that teach error on whatever the subject, marriage and divorce, church involvement in things that the church doesn't need to be involved in, no one seems to care. No one seems to show concern. You know, it's not that brethren always agree with the error, but the argument they make is that, over there in Romans 14, they want to have us to believe that we can agree to disagree on matters of doctrine and on matters of faith. Now, Romans 14, we can agree to disagree on matters that God doesn't care one way or the other. But when it comes to matters of what the scriptures teach, when it comes to matters of what consists and makes up the faith that we're to earnestly contend for, we can't throw those things into Romans 14 and argue that, we can just agree to disagree. Because Romans 14 has nothing whatsoever to do with matters of things contrary to God's will. It has everything to do with things that don't matter with God. What do we do or what do we don't? God doesn't care. And then, and only then, in those things, do we have liberty to agree to disagree. And they want to redefine false teachers. Back a few years ago, there seemed to be this push on the part of some that wanted to define, or as I said, redefine what a false teacher was. And according to their definition of what a false teacher was, you could smell one 5 miles away. Because that's just the way they painted it. That's what this person had to possess. This is the kind of person he had to be in order before he could ever be called a false teacher. But you know, we saw different from that in our study this morning, didn't we, on the Sermon on the Mount? Jesus said, beware of false teachers, for they will appear to you as sheep in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they're ravenous wolves. No, we're not gonna smell them 5 miles away. They're gonna be right up in our face. And unless we put them to the test, that's where it comes in. But yet there has been that effort been made to try to redefine what a false teacher is. You see, those teachers and those things that are being taught for truth that are really error, they're warned, they're condemned. Let's look at 2 John, verses 9 through 11. Whoever transgresses and does not abide in the doctrine of Christ does not have God. He who abides in the doctrine of Christ hath both the Father and the Son. If anyone comes to you and does not bring this doctrine, do not receive him into your house, nor greet him. For he who greets him shares in his evil deeds. Notice what we see in these verses. We see that we're talking about a person who practices sin or error. He's transgressed. He abides not in the doctrine of Christ. And then in that verse 10, he teaches error. As he said there in verse 10, if anyone comes to you and brings not this doctrine, in other words, he don't teach you the truth, but he brings some other doctrine, some other error, then we have a responsibility, and that is if we're not to receive him. Because in receiving him, as he says, we share with him in his evil deeds. When we receive him into our house, when we greet him. Another error issue that non-institutional churches have is error on divorce and remarriage. And there are various areas within just this that we could talk about. There are those who believe that only the alien sinner is accountable, or not accountable. Let me get it right. Alien sinners are not accountable to what Jesus says in Matthew 19:9. That's a passage that only applies to Christians. So what that allows for is that alien sinner can marry, remarry, divorce, and whatever as many times as they want, and then when they obey the gospel, then Matthew 19:9 is binding upon them. Then there are those who say that the guilty party can remarry. That is, the person that has committed fornication in a marriage relationship, that they have a right to remarry, when Jesus said very clearly that those that have been put away for the cause of fornication, if they remarry, commit adultery. And then there are those that have advocated for years now mental divorce. That is, if you're a person in a marriage and your spouse puts you away for some reason other than fornication, you're still a put away person. But then all you need to do is bide your time until that spouse goes out and marries someone else. Then now you can mentally put that person away for the cause of fornication. And there are a lot of preachers that have encompassed or embraced this idea. And then there are those that say that the person that has been put away can remarry. And they base that upon 1 Corinthians 7 and verse 15. Well, here is a woman that's married to an unbelieving husband, and he puts her away, and verse 15 says she's no longer under bondage. And brethren want to take that word bondage and make it apply to the marriage bond. And it doesn't apply to the marriage bond. It simply applies to the responsibility. It has nothing to do with the bond. The bond is still intact. That's why Paul went ahead to say that let her either remain unmarried or be reconciled. So 1 Corinthians 7 and verse 15 is not authorization or proof that a person that has been put away has a right to remarry. And then there are those, in fact, a very influential preacher or was the editor of one of what I call the Brotherhood magazine. He came out a few years ago with at least 100 reasons that you could divorce your mate. So as I said, there are various things that are taught, and all of these are being taught within non-institutional churches concerning just marriage and remarriage or divorce and remarriage. But again, the Lord's teaching is clear. Matthew 19, verse 9, I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery. And whoever marries her who is divorced commits adultery. There's nothing complicated. It's very clear. And it's also very serious. Very serious. You know, when you think about adultery, we're talking lost souls. When you look at Galatians 5, now the works of the flesh are evident. What does it start with? There's 17 things specifically that are mentioned in these verses. And we know, of course, it ends with and such like, but there's 17 things that are specifically stated as works of the flesh. And the very first one is adultery. So it's serious. For Jesus to say, whoever puts away his wife except it be for fornication and marries another commits adultery, that's serious. And when Jesus said, whosoever marries her that is put away commits adultery, that's serious. And Paul talked about how that the matter can even leaven an entire church, like the church at Corinth in 1 Corinthians 5, in the matter of the man that was committing fornication. That's why it's serious. These things concerning divorce and remarriage. But another issue among non-institutional churches is modernism. For example, the days of creation. That has been something that's been advocated. Never would have thought it 25, 30 years ago, that brethren would try to say that the 7 days of creation in Genesis, instead of them being 6 literal days, would you have ever thought that there would have been gospel preachers or even Christians that would advocate that that's really millions, thousands and millions and billions of years? But yet that's where we're at. You know, in Exodus 31, verse 15, what we see in these verses is the creation week is compared to the work week. Let's read what it says. Work shall be done for 6 days, but the 7th day is the Sabbath of rest, holy to the Lord. Whoever does any work on the Sabbath day, he shall surely be put to death. Therefore, the children of Israel shall keep the Sabbath, to observe the Sabbath throughout their generations as a perpetual covenant. It's a sign between me and the children of Israel forever. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, and on the 7th day he rested and was refreshed. See the context? Now we know that we don't observe the Sabbath day. We know that this was the law that God gave to the Israelites under the law of Moses. But I'm just using these verses to show us that what we see here is the days of creation are being used in comparison to the work week. Because God is commanding them that 6 days you can work, but the seventh is the Sabbath. You're to rest on the Sabbath. So we're talking about a work week composed of 6 days in which there is a seventh day that work is no longer to be done. And that is showed the fact that the Lord, notice that 17th verse, in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, and on the seventh day he rested and was refreshed. So see the comparison? The work week being on the same resemblance of the 6 days that God created and rested on the seventh. You know, in Psalms chapter 33, verse 6, we see how God created. By the word of the Lord the heavens were made, and all of the host of them by the breath of his mouth. He gathers the waters of the sea together as a heap. He lays up the deep in storehouses. Let all of the earth fear the Lord. Let all of the inhabitants of the world stand in awe of him. For he spoke, and it was done. He commanded, and it stood fast. It didn't take the Lord hundreds of millions and billions of years to speak existence into anything that was created. He spoke it. How long does it take for you to speak? Not long, does it? Well, that's how God created. He spoke, and it was done. He commanded, and it stood fast. It undermines, all of this undermines our belief, really, in the rest of the book of Genesis, doesn't it? And not only does it undermine our belief in the book of Genesis, what about all of the other 65 books of the Bible? If we can lend so much discredit to the creation, then what can we not challenge, question in any of the things that are written in God's Word? Another form of modernism that has taken shape is that the flood was not universal. It was just a local. Another form of modernism is that the serpent that was mentioned in Genesis 3, there are those that says it wasn't literal. The serpent that beguiled Eve, well, notice what Paul said about it in 2 Corinthians 11 and verse 3. But I fear that somehow as the serpent deceived Eve by his craftiness, so your minds may be corrupted from the simplicity that is in Christ. Did Paul, an inspired apostle, believe that the serpent was not literal? No, he believed it was literal. So this is just another one of those issues. And another issue among non-institutional churches is repeating the errors of the past. Churches involving themselves in social matters, like we talked about last week in the social gospel. The shift from the spiritual to the physical. That's being repeated. Churches now that say that, well, you know, I really just can't say that mechanical instruments of music in the assembly and the worship is the wrong thing. So we see differences. Differences not just in churches of Christ, whether they're institutional or non-institutional, but we see differences in the churches of Christ in matters of those that are non-institutional. They've resorted in far too many places to soft preaching. They've resorted to being soft, to being tolerant on worldliness. They have resorted to being tolerant of error and the teachers of error. They teach error, or they don't teach at all on the subject of divorce and remarriage. For the sake of numbers, they engage in modernism, and they're repeating those errors of the past when it comes to what the social gospel has involved so many churches in. What I'm saying is, in this close of our study, these issues are serious, and they're not minor by any stretch of the imagination. They're serious. The matter of authority, it's serious. It's a serious matter. The matter of encouraging worldliness, it's a serious matter. The matter of tolerating error that causes souls to be lost. We talked about that in our Bible study this morning when Jesus warned about false teachers. Why? Because they cause souls to be lost. And that's what error does. Only truth saves. But error will damn our souls. And all of these things, all of these issues that we've looked at, they undermine our faith. So does it matter which Church of Christ? I'll leave that answer up to you, because I think we have studied it from both of these standpoints, hopefully, well enough that you can give an answer without me having to give the answer. And I hope that your answer will be in harmony with God's will. I hope that your stand will be on the stand on the Lord's side. For you and your house, as Joshua said, we will serve the Lord. So I hope our study has been helpful. I just hope it's been helpful, because we, as Hebrews 2 and verse 1 says, we can let things slip so easily. And I hope that this is one of the things that this lesson has helped with, to not let it slip. From those that knew it, and I hope it's been a lesson that has been beneficial to teach those that may not have been aware of it. Some of those very ones that say, well, the signs out front, it's on the building, Church of Christ, it must be okay. Or those that say, well, it's non-institutional, so it's got to be sound. And I hope we see how that those type of statements are really very shallow when it comes to this matter at hand. So tonight, if you're here and you've not obeyed the gospel, let now be the time, the opportunity. If you're here and as a Christian, there's things in your life that you need to make correction of, don't let the sun set for what you're not right with God. We don't know when death comes. We don't know when Christ will come again. We don't know when there'll be something that may happen in our lives that will rob us, strip us of the opportunity to repent of sin. So many uncertainties. Let now, as Paul said, be the accepted time, today, the day of salvation.